Chapter 6, Kathmandu Interlude. 2 years before, during the spring and summer of '69, I lived in Nepal and studied the Tibetan language. The wave of interest in Buddhist studies was just beginning, so that those of us in Nepal with Tibetan interests were a tightly knit group. My purpose in studying Tibetan was different from that of most Westerners involved with the language in Nepal. They were nearly all interested in some aspect of Mahayana Buddhist thought, while I was interested in the religious tradition that antedated the introduction of Buddhism into Tibet in the 7th century. The indigenous pre-Buddhist religion of Tibet was a kind of shamanism, closely related to the classical shamanism of Siberia. Tibetan folk shamanism is called Pön, and it continues to be practiced today in the mountainous area of Nepal that borders Tibet. Practitioners of Pön are usually despised by the Buddhist community, being thought of as heretics and generally low types. My interest in Pön and its practitioners, the Pönpo, arose out of an interest in Tibetan painting. It is a commonplace of such painting that the most fantastic, extravagant, and ferocious images are drawn from the pre-Buddhist substratum of folk imagery. The terrifying, multi-armed and multi-headed guardians of the Buddhist teaching, called Dharmapalas, with their aureoles of flame and light, are autochthonous Pön deities whose allegiance to the late-arriving Buddhist religion is maintained only by powerful spells and rituals which bind and secure these forceful demons. It seemed to me that the shamanic tradition that spawns such outlandish and fantastic images must have at some time had the knowledge of a hallucinogenic plant. Shamanic ecstasy in Siberia was attained through the use of Amanita muscaria, and R.G. Wasson has made a good case for the use of the same mushroom in Vedic India. Since Tibet is situated roughly between these two areas, it did not seem impossible that before the coming of Buddhism, hallucinogens were part of the indigenous shamanic tradition. Amanita muscaria was only one of several plants that might have served as a hallucinogen in ancient Tibet. Pegamen harmala of the Zygophalaceae is another hallucinogen. It, like Banisteriopsis caapi, contains the hallucinogenic alkaloid harmine in considerable quantities and is probably a hallucinogen by itself. Certainly in combination with a DMT-containing plant, of which the flora of India boasts several, Arundodonax, for example, it should yield a strong hallucinogen whose composition would not differ chemically from the ayahuasca and yahe brews of Amazonas. My interest in Tibetan painting and hallucinogenic shamanism led me to Nepal. I had learned that there were refugee camps in Nepal and near Simla in India, whose populations were nearly entirely outclassed Pönpo, unwelcome in the camps where Buddhist refugees were housed. I wanted to learn from the Pönpo whatever they still retained of any knowledge of hallucinogens that they might once have had. I was convinced that the original source of the fantastic images in Tibetan painting must be a shamanic use of plant hallucinogens. I wished, in my naivete, to prove this idea and to write a monograph about it. As soon as I arrived in Asia, the enormity of the task and effort that it would require were seen more nearly in their correct proportions. My proposed project was actually an outline for a life of scholarly research. Naturally, I found that nothing could be done at all until I was familiar with the Tibetan language. I put aside all the ideas I had hoped eventually to research, and instead resolved simply to dedicate myself to learning as much Tibetan as I could in the few months that circumstances gave me in Nepal. I moved out of Kathmandu, away from the pleasures of the hashish dens and the social swirl of the international community of travelers, smugglers, and adventurers that had made Kathmandu its own. I moved to Bodhanath, a small village of great antiquity a few miles east of Kathmandu and recently flooded with Tibetans from Lhasa, people who spoke the Lhasa dialect that is understood throughout the Himalayas. The people of the village were Buddhist, and I made my arrangements to study with the monks there without mentioning my interest in the Punpo, a tradition considered by them debased and pagan. I sought lodging and came to terms with Denbadu, the local miller and a Newari. He agreed to rent a room on the third floor of his prosperous adobe house which fronted the muddy main street of Bodhanath. I struck a bargain with a local girl who agreed to bring me fresh water each day, and I settled comfortably in. I whitewashed the adobe walls of my room, commissioned a huge mosquito net in the market in Kathmandu, and arranged my books and small Tibetan bench inside. I was very comfortable and treasured my existence as a traveler and scholar. Tashi Yaltsin Lama was my teacher. He was a very kind and understanding Gelugpa. In spite of his age, he would arrive every morning promptly at 7 for our 2-hour lesson. I was like a child. We began with penmanship and the alphabet. Each morning after the Lama departed, I would study for several more hours, and then the rest of the day was my own. I explored the King's Game Sanctuary further east of Bodhanath and the Hindu Ghats at nearby Pashupatinath. I also made the acquaintance of the few Westerners that were living in the vicinity. Among those whom I met, there were an English couple of my own age. They were self-consciously fascinating. He was thin and blonde, with an aquiline nose and an arch manner. He was the model product of the British public school system, haughty and urbane, but eccentric and often hilarious. She was small and unhealthily thin. Scrawny is the word I use to describe her to myself. She was from Somerset, red-haired and wild-tempered, cynical and like her companion with a razor wit. They had both been disowned by their families, were traveling hippies as we all were then. Their relationship was bizarre. They had stuck together from England, but the relaxing of tension which arrival in bucolic Nepal had brought had been too much for their fragile liaison. Now they lived apart, he at one end of Bodhanath and she alone at the other, and they met only for the combined purpose of visiting someone or of abrading each other's nerves. In that exotic setting, they managed to charm me completely. Whether alone or together, I was always interested to pause from my studies and to pass some time with them. Naturally, we discussed my work at times, and since it involved hallucinogens, they were very interested, being familiar with LSD from their days in the London scene. We discovered that we had mutual friends in India, that we all loved the novels of Thomas Hardy. We became fast friends. It was a pleasant time. During this time, my personally evolved method for probing the shamanic dimension was to smoke DMT at the peak point of an LSD experience. I would do this whenever I took LSD, which was quite occasionally, and it would allow me to enter the tryptamine dimension for a slightly extended period of time. As the summer solstice of '69 approached, I laid plans for such an experiment. I would take LSD the night of the solstice and sit up all night on my roof smoking hashish and stargazing. I mentioned my plan to my 2 English friends, and they expressed a desire to join me. This was fine with me, but the problem was that there was not enough reliable LSD for them to take any. My own tiny supply had arrived in Kathmandu, prophetically hidden inside a small ceramic mushroom mailed from Aspen. Almost as a joke, I suggested that they substitute the seeds of the Himalayan Datura metal, for the LSD. Daturas are the source of a number of tropane alkaloids, scopolamine, hyoscyamine, etc., compounds which produce a pseudo-hallucinogenic effect. They give an impression of flying or of confronting visions, but all in a very hard to keep control of and difficult to recollect later dimension. The seeds of Datura metal are used in Nepal by sadhus, or wandering hermits and holy men, so their use was not unknown in the area. Nevertheless, my suggestion was made facetiously, since the difficulty of controlling Datura is legendary. To my surprise, my friends agreed that this was something they wanted to do. We arranged that they would arrive at my home at 6 on the appointed day. When the evening finally came, I moved my blankets and pipes up to the roof of the building. From there I could command a fine view of the surrounding village with its enormous stupa with staring eyes. The upper golden levels of the stupa were at that time encased in scaffolding where repairs necessitated by a lightning strike suffered some months previously were going on. The white-domed bulk of the stupa gave the adobe mud village of Bodhnath a Saussurian and unearthly quality. Further away, rising up many thousands of feet, I could see the great Annapurna range. In the middle distance, the land was a patchwork of emerald paddy. 6 o'clock came and went, and my friends had not arrived. At 7 they had still not been seen, and so I took my treasured tab of orange sunshine and settled down to wait. 10 minutes later they arrived. I could already feel myself going, and so gestured to the 2 piles of datura seeds that I had prepared. They took them downstairs to my room and ground them in a mortar and pestle before washing them down with some tea. By the time they had returned to the roof and gotten comfortably settled, I was surging through mental space. We sat, and hours seemed to pass. When they seated themselves, I had been too distant to be aware of what was going on. She was seated directly across from me, and he further back to one side and in the shadow. He played his flute, I passed the pipe, and the hours passed. The moon rose high in the sky and full. I fell into long hallucinatory reveries that each lasted many minutes. When I emerged from a particularly long spell of visions, I found that my friend had stopped playing and gone away, leaving me with his lady. I had promised them both that I would let them try some DMT during the evening. My glass pipe and tiny stash of waxy orange DMT were right before me. Slowly and with the fluid movements of a dream, I filled the pipe and offered it to her. The stars, hard and unglittering, stared down from a mighty distance on all of this. She took the pipe and took 2 deep inhalations, sufficient for a person so frail. Then the pipe was returned to me, and I followed her into it with 4 huge inhalations, the 4th of which I held on to until I had broken through. For me, it was an enormous amount of DMT, and I immediately felt the sense of entering a high vacuum. There was a high-pitched whine and the sound of cellophane ripping as I was transformed into the radio intellect that is a human being in DMT ecstasy. I was surrounded by the chattering elf machines and the more than Arabian vaulted spaces that would shame a Bibiana, manifestations of a power both alien and bizarrely beautiful raging around me. At the point where I would normally have expected the visions to fade, The pre-treatment with LSD synergized the situation to a higher level. With the translinguistic glossolalia of the DMT elf machines howling in my ears, I suddenly found myself flying hundreds of miles above the earth, and in the company of silvery discs, several, I could not tell how many. I looked down and realized that I was moving south, apparently in Earth orbit, over Soviet Siberia. Ahead of me I could see the great plain of Shan and the mass of the Himalayas rising up in front of the red-yellow waste of India. The sun would rise in about 2 hours. In a series of telescoping leaps, I went from orbit to a point where I could specifically pick out the round valley that is the Kathmandu Valley. Then, in the next leap, the valley filled my field of vision. I seemed to be approaching it in ground level at great speed. I could see the Hindu temple and the houses of Kathmandu, the temple of Swayambhunath to the west of the city, and the stupa at Bodhanath, gleaming white a few miles to the east. Then Bodhanath was a mandala of houses and circular streets filling my vision, and among the several hundred rooftops, I found my own. The next moment I slammed into my body and was refocused on the rooftop and the woman in front of me. Incongruously, she had come to the event wearing a silver satin full-length evening dress, an heirloom, the sort of thing one would have found in an antique clothing store in Notting Hill Gate. I fell forward and thought that my hand was covered with some cool white liquid. It was the fabric of the dress. To that moment, neither of us had thought of the other as a lover. Our relationship had functioned on a quite different level. Suddenly, all the normal sets of relations were obviated. We both reached out toward the other, and the impression I had was distinctly that of passing through her, of physically reaching beyond her. She pulled her dress overhead in a single gesture. I did the same with my shirt, which ripped to pieces in my hands as I took it off over my head. I heard buttons fly, and I heard my glasses land somewhere and shatter. Then we made love, or rather we had an experience that vaguely related to making love, but was a thing unto itself. We were both howling and singing the glossolalia of DMT, rolling over the ground with everything awash and crawling geometric hallucinations. She was transformed. Words exist to describe what she became. Pure anima, Kali, Lucathea, something erotic but not human, something addressed to the species and not to the individual, glittering with the possibility of cannibalism, madness, space, and extinction. She seemed on the edge of devouring me. Reality was shattered. This kind of fucking must go on at the very limit of what is possible. Everything had been transformed into orgasm and visible chattering oceans of elf language. Then I saw that where our bodies were glued together was flowing out of her cunt, over me, over the floor of the roof. Flowing everywhere was some sort of obsidian liquid, something dark and glittering with color and lights within it. After the DMT flash, after the many orgasms with the transformed woman become myth and archetype, after all of this new thing shocked me to the core. What was it and what was going on? I looked at it, I looked right into it, and it was the surface of my own mind reflected in front of me. Translinguistic matter, the living opalescent excrescences of the abyss of hyperspace. Something generated by the sex act performed under such crazy conditions. I looked into it again and saw now a scene. The Lama who taught me Tibetan, who should be asleep a mile away. In the fluid I saw him, in the company of a monk I had never seen. They were looking into a mirrored plate. Then I realized that they were watching me. I could not understand it. I looked away from the fluid, looked away from my companion whom I could not look at. Her aura of strangeness was so intense. Then I realized that we had been singing and yodeling and uttering wild orgasmic howls for what must have been several minutes. It meant everyone in Bodenoff must be awake and about to open their doors and windows and demand to know what was going on, and what was going on. Good God! The thought of discovery sobered me enough to realize that we must get away from this exposed situation, both of us completely naked and the scene around us one of total, unexplainable chaos. She was lying down, unable to get up, and so I picked her up and made my way down the narrow staircase, past the grain storage bins, and into my room. All the time I remember saying over and over to her and to myself, "I am a human being. I am a human being." I was no longer sure. We waited in my room many minutes. Slowly it dawned that by some miracle no less strange than everything else that had gone on, no one was awake demanding to know what was occurring. No one seemed even to have heard. To calm us, I made tea, and as I did this, I had a chance to assess my companion's state of mind. She seemed quite delirious, quite unable to discuss with me what had gone on only a few moments before on the roof. It is an effect typical of datura that whatever experiences one has, they are very difficult, usually impossible to recollect later. It seemed that though what had gone on had involved the most intimate of acts between two people, nevertheless I had been the only witness who could remember anything at all of what had happened. Pondering all of this, I crept back to the roof and collected my glasses. Incredibly, they were unbroken, although I had distinctly heard them break. With my glasses and our clothes, I returned to my room where my companion was sleeping. I smoked a little hashish and then climbed into the mosquito net and lay down beside her. In spite of all the excitement and the stimulation of my system, I went immediately to sleep. I have no idea how long I slept. When I awoke, it was with a start and from a deep slumber. It was still dark, and there was no sign of my friend. I felt a stab of alarm. If she was delirious, then it was very bad for her to be wandering alone around the village at night. I jumped up and threw on my jalaba and began to search, not on the roof, not near the grain storage. I found her on the ground level of the building. She was sitting on the earth floor, staring at her reflection in the gas tank of a motorcycle that belonged to the miller's son-in-law. She was still disoriented in the way that is typical, hallucinating persons present, mistaking one person for another. "Are you my tailor?" she asked me several times as I led her back to my room. When we were both once again upstairs in my quarters, I took off my jalava, and we both discovered that I was wearing what she delicately described as my knickers. They were quite too small on me, and neither of us knew how they had come to be on me. It was the capstone of an amazing evening, and I roared with laughter. I returned her knickers to her, and we went to bed, puzzled, reassured, exhausted, and amused. As this experience passed behind us, the girl and I became even closer friends. We never made love again. It was not really the relationship that suited us. She remembered nothing of the events on the roof. About a week after all this was history, I told her my impression of what had happened. She was amazed but accepting. I did not know what had happened. I christened the obsidian fluid we had generated love, L-U-V, something more than love, something less than love, perhaps not love at all, but some kind of unplumbed potential human experience very little is known about. It was this incident which rekindled my interest in the violet fluids which ayahuasca shamans are said to generate on the surface of their skins and use to divine and cure. Whenever I tell this story, it is the phenomenon of the liquid that I stress. That was what I accentuated to assure Dennis that night at La Chirera. I did not tell the absurd part about waking up wearing someone else's underwear. It was damn embarrassing and absurd and contributed nothing to the story. At that time, I had never told anyone that part of the incident. It was a personal memory. I mention this because that absurd incident was later to be the focus of an instance of telepathy that was the most convincing that I have ever witnessed.